Micah chapter number 6, and we were just talking about the biblical idea of justice versus the world's idea of justice, and we were in Micah chapter number 6. Again, I remind you that we are in the middle of a series here called Avoiding Confusion, Interpreting Cultural Issues Through a Biblical Worldview. And we have gone through several different topics along the way here, and we've arrived at justice. And again, I remind you that on the back table there's a few more worksheets back there for you to be filling in as we go along through this lesson here. If you need one, there's at least one back there, I'm not sure if anybody needs it. But we're talking about the biblical understanding of justice. And we talked about what the Word of God has to say about it, specifically here from Micah chapter number 6. And so we read verses 1 through 8, and I want us to go ahead and read through those verses now, so that as I continue in my review, we're reminded together about what these points are dealing with. So look at, again, Micah chapter 6, beginning in verse number 1. Micah 6, verse number 1 says, "Hear ye now what the Lord saith. Arise, contend thou before the mountains, and let the hills hear thy voice. Hear ye, O mountains, the Lord's controversy, and ye strong foundations of the earth. For the Lord hath a controversy with his people, and he will plead with Israel. O my people, what have I done unto thee? And wherein have I wearied thee? Testify against me. For I brought thee up out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed thee out of the house of servants. And I sent before thee Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now what Balak, king of Moab, consulted, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered him from Shittim unto Gilgal, that ye may know the righteousness of the Lord. Wherewith shall I come before thee, Lord, and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He hath showed thee, O man, what is good. And what doth the Lord require of thee? But to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God." And so here in Micah chapter 6, we see a dialogue that goes on between, well, let me back that up. I have a better image than dialogue here. It's that outdoor courtroom like we talked about last Wednesday evening. And who are the witnesses to this courtroom? Do you remember? The mountains are the witnesses. And he reminds us again there in the beginning of chapter 6. "Hear ye now what the Lord saith. Arise, contend thou before the mountains, and let the hills hear thy voice." God says, again, the mountains and the rivers and the plains and the valleys, they've witnessed all the good things that I've done for Israel. And yet Israel has turned its back on me time and time again. And so mountains, I want you to witness now. I want you to stand in judgment here as I judge my people. And then he calls upon the nation of Israel. And he looks at them and he says, "Oh, my people." And he says that twice. But it's what he says or asks them after it that's important. "Oh, my people, remember," he says. Or, "What have I done unto thee? And wherein have I wearied thee? What did I do to you to turn you against me? Testify unto me now." This is your chance to stand up and testify before creation, to stand up and tell me what it is I have done. And then he says in verse number 5, to remember, verses 4 and 5, he's reminding them of things that he has done for them. In verses 6 and 7, Micah then, he attempts to stand up and to speak on Israel's behalf, even though there is really no defense that can be offered for Israel. And Micah's defense really is just a series of questions that he asks now. He says, "Wherewith shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before the high God?" He's asking, how do I come before God, and how do I reconcile before God? God, what is it that you want from me? What can I give you, God, to make things right again? Shall I come with burnt offerings and calves a year old? Do you want thousands of rams and 10,000s of rivers of oil? God, would you be pleased if I went so far as to sacrifice my firstborn child? And we talked about that significance of that statement, last Wednesday evening, because this is what so many of the cultures around them were doing, sacrificing their firstborn so that the gods, so to speak, lowercase g gods, would bless their family, bless their farm, bless their business, bless his many wives and, dozens of children that he would no doubt have. What's sacrificing the first one if it's going to bring the blessing of the gods upon me? And they would do that. They would sacrifice, and even Israel got caught up in doing that sort of thing. But God, is that what you want? And as I said last Wednesday evening, it all culminates, the answer culminates into verse number 8, where it gives us 3 specific things that he expects Israel to do. And I dare say I'm not making a giant leap here when I say that he also expects those 3 things from us. Some people will go to great lengths to say, oh, well, this is Old Testament, these are the prophets, this is specifically for Israel, there's nothing here for us as the church. I get that. It was written by Micah. These are his words that God spoke directly through him to the nation of Israel for the specific problems that they were in at that time thousands of years ago. But does that mean that it has no bearing whatsoever for us? That there is no content within it that is useful or a reason for the Holy Spirit to speak to us, the New Testament church, in this dispensation from the book of Micah? Of course there is a way and a reason. And so therefore I say, there's good reason for me to think that these 3 things here mentioned in verse number 8 can also equally apply to us, because it gives us insight into the mind of God and what he desires. It said in verse number 8, what doth the Lord require of thee? 3 things. Do justly. And that's one of the big things we've been talking about here. Do justly. And I said that justice needs to be, number 2, tempered with mercy, to love mercy. That's the second thing. Temper your justice with mercy and to walk humbly with thy God. And this isn't just this humbleness, yes, is dealing with my stance towards God, humbly with God. But I think also in context here, it's dealing with my stance towards men around me. That I am to walk justly or to do justly, while at the same time including mercy and humility. So that I don't look down on somebody else because they've done things or they've been tempted to do things that I wasn't. No, I'm not to look down on them. If not by the grace of God, there I would go doing those very things. And so he gives us these 3 things: to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. And so we spent time last Wednesday evening looking through this. We looked at, those 3 things. Point number 1 was a framework for biblical justice. Letter A is that God is the habitation of justice. Where do we go? Where is our source? The authoritative source for justice. For many, it might be the U.S. Constitution and laws, our American justice system. For others, it may be something aside from that. It may be their own country. Or it may be, some who live in America today reject America's current laws and systems and say, no, it's all about the Confederation, or it's all about this particular legal system that only existed in the 1700s or whatever. The point is, we all point back to some authority. What is the authority for justice? There are many in our society today that think the authority for justice is the whims of society. If society thinks that something has been done unjustly, they want to deal with it right then how they want to do it, rather than following it by the letter of the law. And I can kind of understand that to a certain extent. If somebody robs you, you want the thief, the robber, caught now. You want them caught right away. And not only do you want them caught, you want them prosecuted. You want them prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, unless you're a very merciful, forgiving, and generous person like we're supposed to be, right? You want it done now, and you want them behind bars. And you may say, because I don't want them to do it to anybody else, and that may be partially true, but there's also part of it that is, well, they did it to you, and you want vengeance. Now, I understand that doesn't necessarily apply equally to all of us. But my authority for justice ought not to be my whims. Yesterday, I might not have been so adamant about justice towards that person. But now that it's affected me, I am. Tomorrow, the whim might have passed. And so should justice rise and fall upon the whims of society and culture? Should justice rise and fall based upon the whims of social media or the whims of the philosophers and the professors in the universities? Well, no. Justice is supposed to be stable, structural. It is supposed to maintain its own structure rather than to move and sway with what goes on around it. So where is our source of justice then? Well, last week we said that God is the habitation of justice, meaning that He is that source that we are to look for or look to for justice. And we also said, number 2, that God's people are supposed to model just living. That doesn't just mean that God's people are to sit in judgment of others, but it means that we are to walk as a model of living justness. To walk justly. And we'll talk more about what that means tonight. And then we said, letter C, that men are individually responsible. Okay, this is not identity politics. If you're a member of this subgroup, if you're LGBTQIA+, BZYM2, however many numbers and letters there are these days, I'm lost. Okay, that's a subgroup. Well, then you get stuck in this group, and if somebody does something to that person, then that means they did it to you too. Or, if you're white, or if you're black, or if you're Hispanic, or if you're heterosexual, or if you're homosexual, or if you're any of the other subgroups. No, it's not about the group, it's about the individual. That's how justice is supposed to work. Men are individually responsible. That's how God works, and we talked about that last week as well. So this evening, we're going to look here at point number 2, if you're keeping track on your paper there. Point number 2, expressions of biblical justice. The biblical concept of justice takes place in at least 2 forms. There is the commutative justice, and there is distributive justice. Commutative justice, it speaks to the relational aspect of justice. That means that you're living in a right relationship with God and others. This is doing justly, walking justly. It's not about sitting behind the bench with the gavel and the robes. This is about me on a daily basis with the people I'm around, not sitting as judge, but just doing justly. That I am doing right by them. That I am showing them the level of respect that they have as a child of God, as a human being. And that I am showing that level of respect whether they deserve it or not. This is commutative justice. And then there is distributive justice. Distributive justice, it speaks of impartiality when rendering judgment, when righting wrongs that have been done, when meting out punishment for those who have broken laws. To put that in context, okay, as a principal, I was also a teacher at the same time. And so while I was teaching in my classes, I had the duty as a teacher to mete out judgment to the students in my classroom. But what I was trying to do as a teacher was more so the commutative, aspect of justice. That I was just trying to trying to treat my students with a specific level of respect. Very often, I would refer to my students as sir and ma'am. Maybe that's old-fashioned, maybe that's weird, but I would often, if they'd raise their hand, I'd say, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Sometimes I would get it wrong, usually almost never on purpose, though. I'd get it wrong, like, yes, sir, I mean, ma'am, yes, sir. And I would try to speak to them respectfully like that, because I wanted to be respected in turn, yes. Now, granted, they were younger than me by a lot. Yes, granted, maybe they were also, rebellious or any other number of things that one could look down their nose upon those students, but I wanted to treat them with respect. This is commutative. I needed to treat them with respect, understanding in their, 10, 11-year-old minds, or even 17, 18-year-old minds, they're not going to be able to respond to information the same way that adult me can. They're not going to be able to respond to the same emotional stimuli in the way that adult me can. And so I had to understand those things as I tried to deal respectfully with them on a day-to-day basis. That's the commutative justice. But then there is this distributive justice, which is what I had to do as a principal. Now they're in my office, they have received a certain number of demerits, or they've done something in the classroom or on the playground that is worth dealing with as a specific incident, issue. Mom and dad get called in, and now I have to determine, how am I going to either right the wrong that was done, if there was a wrong? How am I going to mete out justice based upon what has happened? Was it bad enough that they need to be removed from the school for a few days? Or bad enough they need to be removed from the school altogether? Was it bad enough that just simply, or not so bad, that just simply a trip to the principal's office is probably enough to scare them straight, so to speak, to keep them from ever wanting to get involved in something like that ever again? And it varied from student to student and from family to family. That is distributive justice. These are two different concepts of justice, and we have to be aware of both and how we are to mete out both. But specifically in context of justice within a society, we need to understand that God ordains rulers who are divinely authorized to carry out punitive justice. Now, I am not one of those people that God divinely gave me the authority to carry out justice, because I am not a judge. I am not a duly elected or appointed judge of anything, anywhere. The pastor does not sit on any bench and hand out jail time. Well, that might be fun sometimes. That's not my duty. It's not ordained by the government or even by God that I do that. But there are those who are ordained by God to carry out punitive justice. In Romans 13, verse 4, it says this: "But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid." Why? Romans 13 talks a lot about obeying government. Be afraid if you're going to do that which is evil. Why? "For he," this is government, "beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil." On one sense, we have a tendency to look at this verse in regards to the police, because the police are the ones who carry the sword, so to speak. Well, not necessarily. That's not necessarily what this verse is referring to. It's more so referring to the justice system. This is the executioner's sword, and they are the ones who sit in judgment of your wrongdoing and are the ones who are going to decide if you go to jail or if it's off with your head. And that's kind of what that verse there in Romans 13:4 is talking about. But this is also biblical justice. Micah 6:8 here does not merely tell us, though, to understand justice. It tells us to do justly. As Christians, we can't be content to sit on the sideline and watch other people be mistreated, or to sit there and hope somebody else does the right thing. We are supposed to be involved actively in doing justly. Where? Letter A, in society. Went too far, didn't it? There we go. Letter A, in society. You already saw it, so you can see there in Deuteronomy 15:17. God commands his people to care for the poor. Okay, this is a command to them. In Deuteronomy 15:7, it says, "If there be among you a poor man, of one of thy brethren within any of thy gates in thy land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not harden thine heart, nor shut thine hand from thy poor brother." This isn't just specifically given to the rulers and to the judges. This is given to the people of Israel, to not harden your heart toward your poor brethren. God also forbade any partiality in judgment. Here in Leviticus 19, verse number 15, it says, "Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. Thou shalt not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty, but in righteousness thou shalt judge thy neighbor." You notice here, he's not saying you're not going to do it with respect of the poor, nor honor of the person of the mighty. In other words, you're not going to give them extra special respect because they're poor, or extra special respect because they're mighty. You just simply have to mete out judgment in righteousness. It's easy for us to sit and we watch the news and we think, well, how did they get away with that? And then how did they get away with that? Oh, they only got away with that because they're fill-in-the-blank party, you know. They only got away with that because they're friends with the fill-in-the-blank media. And we just sit there and it's easy for us to say, well, not anybody else could do that and get away with it. And sometimes it's probably true. But that's not how it's supposed to be, is it? Sometimes we think, well, if I had done that, I would be buried under the jail. But because they're a politician, they can get away with it. And that very well may be true, but that's not how it's supposed to be. We're not supposed to have respect of persons when it comes to justice. In the books of Psalms and Proverbs, we're also given instruction to care for the needy and speak up for those who are oppressed. Look here at Psalm 41, verse number 1. It says, cooperate, there we go. To the chief musician, a psalm of David, he says, "Blessed is he that considereth the poor. The Lord will deliver him in time of trouble." This is the person who, when they see that poor person, they're like, ugh, get away from me. Why do you got to be so close to me? Why do you got to be in my day, you know? Why do you got to be up on my street? No, blessed is the person who considers them, thinks about them, thinks about how he can be helping them. Look at Psalm 82, verse 3. "Defend the poor and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and needy." Here in Proverbs 29:7, "The righteous considereth the cause of the poor." The righteous, do you want to be one of the righteous? Then this is one of the things the righteous does. They consider and think about and mull over the cause of the poor. But the wicked regardeth not to know it. What does that mean? They pretend not to even notice. Maybe there's some people in town that are just struggling for one reason or another, and you're aware of it. The wicked pretends they don't even notice, whereas the righteous stops and thinks about it. Now, do you know what we often have a tendency to do? Well, you know, they could be muggers or murderers or something like that, or they could have diseases, or they could be carrying, you know, knives or needles or drugs, and I don't want to put them in my car because they're dirty or this or that. And rather than stopping about that, like, what about them that can't get where they need to go, can't take care of their own basic needs? The righteous person considereth that. Now, the righteous person cannot meet every one of those needs. The righteous person cannot just step in and fulfill every one of their needs for the rest of their life. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't get to our heart, so that we can then make a wise decision about what we can do and how we can help them in the best way. Proverbs 31:9, "Open thy mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy." One author noted that Western nations, traditionally rooted in Christian values, often include a biblical sense of justice into their own justice system. He said that they typically acknowledge a transcendent lawgiver. Transcendent means it transcends our own earth, our own understanding. In other words, God. They acknowledge a transcendent lawgiver. They respect the rule of law. They acknowledge human dignity and God-granted human rights. And this is a hallmark of much of Western society. As much as we get demonized in our own universities today, a hallmark of Christianized Western society is this kind of godly justice. Is it perfect? No. Is it getting corrupted as time goes by? Yes. Nevertheless, we can look back at where our original lawgivers of our land found their source of justice. Like we said, God, the Father, is the habitation of justice. And in many books, we can see how our nation's forefathers looked to the Bible when planning out the rule of law in the United States. This person also said this: they acknowledge human dignity and God-granted human rights. They provide checks on corruption. They establish due process. They entrust the final judgment to God. These are all qualities that protect those who would otherwise be more likely to be taken advantage of. And it is godly justice that makes these provisions to protect the people that don't have the money to provide their own defense, that don't have the wisdom to provide their own defense, that don't have the voice to even know that they need to provide for their own defense. It is this kind of godly justice system that speaks up for them. Because biblical justice is based on God's character. And God's character does not change. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. By the way, that same sentiment is spoken of Jesus Christ as well. That Jesus is also the same yesterday, today, and forever. Interesting how that same phrase is used for both God the Father and God the Son. I think that is because, to make it rhyme, they are three in one. It was the Western Christians that participated in overthrowing one of Western Christians' greatest shame: slavery. And I was thinking about that today. You know, it was the southern colonies, not solely, but the southern colonies by and large, that brought in the largest amount of slaves into the United States. Many of the northern colonies were religious colonies, and that presented problems in and of itself, and we've talked about that in the past when we looked at the history of the church and the problems they had up there in Massachusetts and in some of those colonies. In fact, we went to Fort Monroe out near Virginia Beach while we were away, and at Fort Monroe there's a marker out there on the beach that is supposed to be the place where the first African Americans came ashore in 1619. Maybe you've heard of the 1619 Project, which is, much of it is a fallacy, but it is true that is probably when and where the first enslaved African Americans were brought on the shores of the United States, there at Fort Monroe. And, well, what is now Fort Monroe anyways? It wasn't Fort Monroe then. And it was a shame that in the South, before and during the Civil War, many churches and many Christians twisted scriptures and perverted scriptures to support slavery. But yet it was also Christians who were behind overthrowing it. God is very particular, God is very specific in His forbidding of kidnapping a person from their home and selling them into slavery. Look here at Exodus 21, verse number 16. It says, "And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death." You know who John Newton is? He is the man who wrote Amazing Grace. He was a ship's captain, a slaving ship's captain, who would travel over to Africa, pick up slaves on his ship, which they would not be treated well, as they were huddled down beneath decks, all shackled and chained together. If they died, then they were thrown overboard, maybe hours or days after they had died. He would bring them to the shores of the British colonies and French colonies and other places, and they would be taken off, and he would get his pay. Well, after he repented of that lifestyle, we know he writes Amazing Grace. And that's why he says that saved a wretch like me. It wasn't because he was a good Bible-toting Sunday school boy that grew up going to church because his daddy was a preacher and he did everything right his whole life, and now he sings Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a good little boy like me. No, it was that saved a wretch like me, because he knew what kind of stuff he had been doing. He knew the stains and the blots of sin that rested upon him. It was Christians such as William Wilberforce and John Newton, who I just mentioned. They're the ones who led the charge to end slavery in England. England ended slavery before the United States did. They followed scriptural justice rather than whatever the cultural norms were. And when they did that, entire nations were changed by it. And when we as Christians, or even we more broadly as the church, so to speak, if I were to use that term universally, which I don't like the idea of a universal church because we don't see that scripturally, but anyways, when we choose to align ourselves to what culture says is right, there's a good chance we're going to get justice wrong. Remember how I said last Wednesday evening, when you divorce justice from truth, justice and truth both fall in the street. And when we align ourselves with whatever culture is presenting that day, we're probably going to get justice wrong. But when we align ourselves with Scripture, not only are we going to get the issues right, we're going to get justice right, and we as Christians are going to be mirroring God's heart towards other people. That may put us at odds with the culture or society of the time. That ought not be our desire. We ought not wear that as a badge of honor that we are at odds with society or that we've made somebody upset with us. But nevertheless, it will inevitably happen. And so we looked here at how were we to express biblical justice, A, in society, and B, expressing biblical justice among Christians. Letter B, among Christians. Jesus is the ultimate expression of God's heart for the outcast. Think about what Jesus did. He repeatedly reached out to the people that society rejected. Of course, there was the lepers. Society rejected them so much as to cast them out of society to live in their own towns, where many would starve to death. Of course, they would also die of leprosy and other diseases. He sought out the lame. He sought out the broken. In a culture and society where many would look down upon women, he sought them out to heal. He allowed them to come to him, to touch his garments, to come in while he was sitting down at a nice fancy meal, and to anoint his feet and to wash his feet with her hair. He included them. In a culture where the Samaritan was despised, part Jew, part who knows whatever else from the Assyrian and or Babylonian Empire. When they were despised, he went out of his way to give the gospel to the Samaritan woman at the well. I think Jesus is probably our best model of biblical justice. You see, the Jewish society of that time would spit upon that woman at the well if she ever even came close to talking to them. And yet, Jesus went out of his way to find her, to reach her with the gospel. And yet, Jesus goes into the temple and he sees the tables of money and merchandise there in that temple, and he makes whips and he begins to chase the Jews out of the temple because of how they were adulterating religion there in the house of God. I think Jesus is a perfect model of biblical justice, a perfect model of God's heart of compassion and Christ-likeness. There are other people some of the people that we admire the most, names that when I say them to you, you'd be like, oh yeah, I've heard that name before. I know some things about those people. Here are 3 specific Christians of the past who practiced this kind of sacrificial care that led to them helping people who are being exploited, or people who are being orphaned, or people who are being enslaved. It cost them something to help them. Here's a good example. This is George Mueller. George Mueller, he rescued, housed, fed, and educated 10,000 orphans from the streets of England. Taking care of your own kids is hard enough. But then you're having hundreds at a time who are not your children, who are used to living out on the street, doing what they want, when they want, how they want, and now they are going to be controlled. Not only that, George Mueller did not have a great amount of funding to be able to take care of these children of his. And it is a well-known fact through his own biographies or autobiographies that he was a man that was full of prayer and full of faith. Because he didn't always have the means to feed those children that he was called to take care of. But he knew that it was God's will for him to be there. And for him, it's God's will for him to have those children come in and to provide a safe place for them to live. Even if he didn't have milk to put in their cups, he knew that God, if he put him there to do it, then God would also provide for him to do it as well. And so, great faith, great prayer. He began during the middle of the cholera epidemic in the 1830s. And he continued all the way up into his death in 1898. Then there's another one, Amy Carmichael. She spent 50 years in India rescuing young girls from a life of temple prostitution. This gentleman I've already spoken of. His name's William Wilberforce. He labored tirelessly in the British Parliament for many, many, many years to finally see slavery outlawed in all of the British Empire. All of these were Christians who responded compassionately because of their biblical convictions of justice and because of their Christ-like care for other people. Many churches have specific outreach ministries that are meant to be a ministry of compassion. And I think it will be good for us to think of some ideas of ways we can have ministries of compassion. This is a ministry that, I'm not using this ministry to build my church. Okay, this isn't open up the doors and invite everybody in so that we can get more families and more people in the pews and yada yada. Nothing wrong with those. It's good to have events and things like that, ministries like that. But ministries that only cost us time, cost us money, cost us effort, that drain compassion and love from us, but that benefit somebody else. What are some ministries of compassion? I'm not asking for feedback here, at least not immediate feedback. You think about it. Maybe God has gifted you in some way where He could use you in a ministry of compassion, maybe to a nursing home. They don't have anything to offer us. If we go and we minister there, they're not paying us anything in return. They're not giving us anything back. It costs us to be able to minister in compassion. Jails, now I understand that the jail over here we can't really get into. Nobody gets in there and has services or anything like that. That's not really open to us, but what about the juvenile center? Public schools, a bus ministry. Bus ministries are a big drain financially on a church. Because not only do you have to have the vehicle and the fuel and the insurance, and then there's the liability of bringing these children into the church, but the benefit far outweighs the cost to the church. The benefit far outweighs the cost to the workers and the Sunday school teachers who now have messier classrooms because of more kids whose parents never taught them maybe to behave in the right way, or maybe they did. But these are ministries of compassion. What are some ideas for ministries of compassion that you could be instrumental in? Instrumental in starting, instrumental in running, instrumental in being involved in and being a part of. This is part of doing justly. Certainly, doing justly is not something that was just needed in the history in our past. Certainly, doing justly was not just something that was needed during William Wilberforce's time, or during George Mueller's time, or Amy Carmichael's time. Certainly, doing justly and ministering in compassion is not something that just needs to be done in other countries where things are really bad. No, it needs to be done in our own neighborhoods and in our own communities. Do you remember what the Bible says is pure religion? You know this verse, James 1:27. It says, "Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world." Notice this doesn't necessarily include salvation. This is after you become a child of God. You've been saved. Now what? This goes to the heart of compassion that we are supposed to live with. But also it goes to our own personal sanctification and separation from sin to keep himself unspotted from the world. Certainly, doing justly is not just needed in the past or in faraway countries, but here and now as well. Convictions for biblical justice shouldn't lead us to care less for those who are in need. When we are convicted by biblical justice, it should lead us to care even more for the people who are in need. It should lead us to care more for the people maybe who are in a ditch of their own digging. And we can scorn them, or we can look down at them, and we can scold them and say, "You made your own decisions, it's your own fault, blah, blah, blah." Whether it's a ditch of their own digging or not, what would Jesus have done? What did Jesus do when we look at how he behaved when he was alive in the Gospels? He healed. He saved. He forgave. He showed mercy. He gave a fresh start. When the crowd brought to Jesus the woman who had been caught in prostitution, and they brought her and threw her down at the feet of Jesus, and they said, "We just caught this woman committing fornication. The Old Testament law says we should stone her to death. What do you think, Jesus? Should we stone her to death?" Do you think Jesus pulled out his pocket Torah? Well, sure enough, it does say that, doesn't it? She should be stoned to death by law. Jesus knew very well what it said. He is the Word of God. The Bible says he stooped down, and with his finger he wrote something in the dirt. The Bible never tells us what he wrote in the dirt. And there is a whole host of people, trying to guess about what it was he must have been writing. I assume it had something to do with what the conversation was about. Some people think that he began enumerating some of the sins that they were committing. I don't know if he wrote their names and wrote thief beside it. Wrote another name and wrote adulterer beside it. Wrote another name and wrote some other sin that somebody was secretly involved in. And then he says, "He that is without sin, cast the first stone." Jesus did not say, "No, don't stone her." He said, "Go ahead and stone her, but only the person who is guiltless of committing any sin. Then you alone are worthy of throwing that stone and killing her." And something, and again, many believe it was what he was writing in that sand, but something changed everybody's minds. Something turned the spirit of everybody in that moment so that they all hung their heads in shame and walked away. You can hear stones dropping from hands. Thud, 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 as people walked away, leaving nobody but Jesus and that woman there at his feet. She gets forgiven. She's told to go and sin no more. This is the heart of compassion that Jesus Christ has. And when we have a conviction for biblical justice, it will lead us to care more. It will lead us to exercise greater compassion. Let that weigh upon your heart this week. And ask the Lord to open up a door, at least one, of opportunity for you to show compassion to somebody, to somebody who doesn't deserve your compassion, to somebody that maybe you normally would have just pretended to not even notice, pretended like you didn't know there was a problem. And thirdly, think about this week a ministry of compassion that you could involve yourself in. One that does not pay you back anything. One that may not seem to reap any kind of physical dividend for the church, but may only cost us something, but nevertheless reaps spiritual benefits, which we may not see on this side of eternity, but we sure will when we get to heaven for an eternity.